Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Lee, I am particularly interested in your background, of course, as a former lender myself. We share that experience, but also just in reviewing your biography. It notes that you were the first Western professor to teach in a post-communist country. What an experience of a lifetime. I'm very interested to hear your experience, and I have some questions on that, if I may. Would you agree that when governments centralize housing decisions, the result is slower builds, structural inefficiencies, and less fiscal transparency?
Yes. The first time I went was in March of '91. I went into Warsaw because the government of Canada provided it. Joe Clark was the minister, and Prime Minister Mulroney announced a program of support for Hungary and Poland, just those two countries. We got a grant from External Affairs to set up a business school in Warsaw. I'd never been to a non-Western country. I mean, I'd been to, the Caribbean, like Canadians, but I went in there with unbelievable naivete. And I was just unbelievably shocked. The quality of the housing was just unbelievably bad. I mean, the idea that while they treated the environment better in the centrally planned economies, I saw them pour chemicals on the ground in the countries. And I didn't just go to Poland. I taught in Ukraine many times. I taught in Romania many times. I taught in Russia, and it was common across the housing stock was lousy, terrible. The water quality, the infrastructure. And so, one day you'd just get up and there's no hot water. There's no water in the shower. So, it was very, very poor. And of course, there was no transparency because this was even though I went right after the collapse, it was still de facto centrally planned communist country for another 2, 3, 4, 5 years until they transitioned, because the transition wasn't overnight. But the housing stock was the shocker for me because I was sleeping in private homes. I wasn't staying in a hotel. We were renting from local people. And so this was my first experience living in a non-Western country, and it was a shock. It was real culture shock for me. And I'd traveled all over Europe before that, Western Europe, but it's quite the experience going to a non-Western country.
Thank you. So now talking about Canada, when the federal government declares itself a builder now, it wants to centralize building, do you think that creating another bureaucracy now would be the right answer to alleviate the serious housing crisis that we have right now?
I want to nuance my answer. I am not talking about nonprofit housing or social housing. That's not my domain. That's the domain of my distinguished colleague beside me. I don't study nonprofit housing or social housing. I don't study it. I'm just talking private for-profit housing, which is the vast majority of the housing units in our country. If you go and look at the housing stock, and CMHC, shout out to CMHC, they produce some of the most fantastic stats I've ever seen anywhere. Really good data, really good data. They're chief economists, they're assistant economists. To your point, I don't mean this to sound ideological, and I have enormous respect for the government of Canada. My father was 42 years in the government. My partner was 35 years. I have relatives in the government of Canada. I'm not an anti-public servant. I am a public servant as a public professor in a public university. But I don't believe that governments, it's not their role to build houses. They're the referee of the hockey game. Their job is not to tell Sidney Crosby when to shoot the puck. Or their role is not to own the hockey team. Their role is to make sure they call penalties when somebody's cheating in the hockey game. So, and the private sector just does a better job building houses or building cars, building hamburgers.
Thank you for that. And would you also agree then that the private sector in a market-oriented model, not federal agencies, are better equipped to determine where and what types of homes are needed?
You're touching on something I ran out of time to talk about, and I just think there's and by the way, our young people, because I have 250 students a year, 5 courses, 50 students per class. So that's all I deal with is young people. And boy, they're angry at us. They are really, really, really angry at us, okay? And to your point, and I want to get these stats out very quickly. StatsCan, it's either StatsCan or Immigration Borders Canada. 75% of all the immigrants to Canada locate in 5 cities. 5 cities, 75%. And so whether it's $1 million a year, $500,000 a year, I'm not going to get into that debate. Where I'm going with this is the people I'm criticizing at municipal level are really pro-densification. Okay, it's fine. But we're talking about putting 3/4 of all the immigrants into 5 cities in the urban core? This doesn't make sense. And when you look at the polling data, it's across the board, doesn't matter your ideology or your political partisanship. Vast majority of Canadians want to have their house in the burbs. They want their place in the sunshine.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. I'm going to have to stop it there because we're going to have to move on to the next round. Thank you, Ms. Kavina.